Welcome to another IB Environmental Systems and Societies video. Today we're going to focus on the standard level content for ESS topic 4.4, water pollution. This is one of the most pressing environmental challenges facing both marine and freshwater ecosystems around the world. Water is essential for all life on Earth, but human activities are threatening the quality of this precious resource. By the end of the video, you should understand where water pollution comes from, how we measure it, and what can be done to protect our aquatic ecosystems. So let's get into it. Let's start with the big idea. Water pollution doesn't come from just one place. It has many different sources. Think about all the ways that water gets contaminated. Sewage from cities, fertilizers running off farm fields, chemicals from factories, and trash that washes into rivers. Each of these sources creates different problems, but they all share something in common. They significantly harm marine and freshwater systems. When we say marine systems, we're talking about oceans and coastal areas. Freshwater systems includes rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Both types of ecosystems are incredibly vulnerable to human pollution. Let's examine our first major pollution source, sewage. Sewage is organic waste, the material that comes from toilets, showers, and animal waste. You might think this is just natural waste, but when it enters waterways in large quantities, it creates serious problems. Here's why. Sewage contains high levels of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, and those promote algal growth. While this might sound like it would be good for aquatic plants, too much algae actually causes harm. When bacteria decompose this organic waste, they consume or use up all the dissolved oxygen from the water. Remember, fish and other aquatic animals need dissolved oxygen to breathe just like we need oxygen from the air. So, as the dissolved oxygen levels drop, aquatic life suffers. Additionally, sewage often contains harmful pathogens. Those are disease-causing microorganisms like bacteria and viruses that can make both wildlife and people sick. The image you see shows a waterway in Jakarta, Indonesia, where an informal settlement lacks proper sewage infrastructure. Without treatment systems or pipes to carry the waste away, sewage flows directly into the water. This is a reality for millions and millions of people around the world, particularly in rapidly growing urban areas where infrastructure hasn't kept pace with population growth. Agricultural runoff is another major source of water pollution, and in many places, it's actually the biggest contributor. When farmers apply fertilizers to their crops, they're adding nutrients to help the plants grow. However, when rain falls or when irrigation water flows across fields, it carries these fertilizers along with some animal waste into nearby streams, rivers, and lakes. And here's a striking fact. Fertilizer runoff from agricultural areas can be 5 times higher than runoff from urban areas. Why does this matter so much? Because these fertilizers are loaded with nitrates and phosphates. Those are the same nutrients that cause algae blooms we mentioned earlier. When these nutrients reach water bodies, they trigger a process called eutrophication, which we'll explore in more detail in just a little bit. The Chesapeake Bay in Maryland provides a clear example. Livestock waste from farms throughout the watershed eventually makes its way into the bay, and that contributes to ecosystem disruption. This shows how pollution in one spot can travel through watersheds and then affect ecosystems that are actually far downstream. Industrial effluent refers to the wastewater that comes from factories and industrial processes. Unlike sewage or agricultural runoff, industrial effluent often contains heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium, along with various chemicals and organic pollutants. Some industries even release heated water, which causes thermal pollution. That means it increases the water temperature in ways that harm aquatic life. What makes industrial pollutants particularly dangerous is that many of them are non-biodegradable, meaning they don't break down naturally. Instead, they accumulate in the environment and in the bodies of organisms through a process called bioaccumulation. When these pollutants move up the food chain and become more concentrated at each level, we call that biomagnification. So take tributylin or TBT, for example. This chemical was once commonly used in industrial applications, and it caused immunosuppression in wildlife. That means it weakened their immune systems and it made them vulnerable to disease. The foaming water you see in this image from the Mulamutta River in India shows the presence of industrial effluents that are mixed with sewage, and that creates a toxic combination. Urban runoff might surprise you as a pollution source, but it's pretty significant. Every time it rains in a city, water flows across the streets, parking lots, and the rooftops, and it picks up oil, debris, and chemicals along the way. That shimmering rainbow pattern you sometimes see on wet pavement, that's oil, and it's washing into storm drains and eventually into waterways. And here's something pretty remarkable. Stormwater often has higher levels of metals than sewage. During rainfall events, the volume of runoff increases dramatically, and it often overwhelms water treatment systems. Most urban runoff enters waterways completely untreated, and that carries all those pollutants directly into aquatic ecosystems. The image shows oil that's visible in street water in the UK, where studies found that just 1 kilometer of highway generates 126 kilos of oil every year. Multiply that by all the roads in a city, and you can see why urban runoff is such a concern. Now let's talk about solid waste, where plastics are the most visible component. Unlike organic materials that decompose, plastics never truly biodegrade. They only photodegrade. That means they break down into smaller and smaller pieces when they're exposed to sunlight. This process creates microplastics and eventually nanoplastics, which are extremely difficult to remove from the environment. Solid waste, especially plastic, creates multiple ecological impacts. It accumulates in ocean gyres. Those are those large rotating current systems like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Wildlife becomes entangled in larger pieces, and both animals and ecosystems are destroyed. Plastic debris also serves as a transport medium for invasive species, and they carry organisms to new environments where they don't belong. Microplastics contribute to bioaccumulation and biomagnification, just like the chemicals we discussed a few minutes ago. Here's a sobering statistic. Scientists estimate there are approximately 18,000 pieces of plastic per square kilometer of ocean. That's throughout the entire ocean, not just in specific pollution hotspots. Plastic debris accumulation in marine environments has become a crisis requiring immediate management action. We need strategies both to remove plastics from the supply chain, that means preventing them from entering the environment in the first place, and to clear up the existing pollution. Ocean currents transport plastics into gyres that cover massive areas of the Pacific Ocean, anywhere from 700,000 to 15 million square kilometers, which represents about 0.4 and 8.1% of the entire Pacific Ocean. To put that in perspective, that's an area that's potentially larger than the entire United States. Approximately 100 million tons of plastic concentrate in two separate gyres in the ocean. The map you're seeing shows the North Pacific subtropical convergence zone, with the western garbage patch that's near Japan and the eastern garbage patch between California and Hawaii. These aren't solid islands of trash, as they're sometimes misunderstood to be, but rather they're zones where plastic particle concentration is extremely high. Remember how plastics don't biodegrade? Instead, they photodegrade into progressively smaller and smaller pieces. Solar radiation and wind currents contribute to this breakdown process, but the plastic never disappears. It just becomes microplastics and then nanoplastics. That creates a serious problem because these tiny particles are easily eaten by marine organisms, and that threatens both ocean health and food safety. Since microplastics can be no bigger than the width of the human hair, and nanoplastics are even smaller, they can't be effectively cleaned from the ocean due to their size and the scale of the contamination. This graphic shows the size comparison. Regular plastics you can see. Microplastics are visible under magnification, but nanoplastics are only visible with special equipment and oligomers, which are chemical chains that might still be plastic-like in their effects. Now let's shift from pollution sources to how we measure their impacts. Water quality is the measurement of chemical, physical, and biological characteristics of water. That might sound simple, but water quality is actually pretty variable. It changes based on location, on season, on weather, and on human activities. Scientists often use a water quality index, which combines multiple measurements into a single score that tells us how healthy or polluted water is. Monitoring water quality regularly helps us develop management strategies for reducing water pollution. Without measurement, we can't know if our cleanup efforts are working or if the conditions are getting worse. Let's look at the chemical parameters we measure. Starting in the top left, dissolved oxygen is perhaps the most critical. Healthy water should have about 75% oxygen saturation. That means 75% of the maximum amount of oxygen that could dissolve at that temperature. This oxygen is essential for aquatic consumers like fish and invertebrates. Without enough dissolved oxygen, these organisms suffocate and die. pH measures acidity or alkalinity. Neutral pH is 7, which is ideal for most aquatic life. Lower pH means acidic conditions, while higher pH indicates alkaline conditions. Either extreme creates challenges for organisms, and that affects their metabolism and their survival. Temperature matters because as water temperature increases, the amount of oxygen that can dissolve in water decreases. This is why warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and why thermal pollution is so problematic. Turbidity refers to how cloudy water is. High turbidity interferes with light penetration, limiting photosynthesis in aquatic plants. Less photosynthesis means less oxygen production, and that creates a cascading effect. Nitrates and phosphates are nutrients that promote plant growth. However, too much is harmful. Nitrate levels above 6 milligrams per cubic decimeter indicate pollution, while phosphate levels above 15 milligrams per cubic decimeter signal problems. Excess nutrients cause eutrophication. Heavy metals like lead and mercury bioaccumulate in organisms and biomagnify in food webs. That means that they become more concentrated at each trophic level. Top predators end up with dangerous concentrations of these heavy metals. Finally, suspended solids are particles that float in water, and they can make it taste or smell bad, and they can damage plumbing systems. All of these are direct measures of water pollution. We're actually testing the water itself. Biological parameters provide indirect measures of water quality by examining living organisms instead of measuring the water itself. The presence or absence of indicator species tells us about water conditions. Indicator species are organisms that are particularly sensitive or tolerant to pollution. For example, stonefly and mayfly nymphs indicate very clean water. These insects require high oxygen levels and they can't survive in polluted conditions. On the opposite end of the spectrum, tubifex worms indicate high pollution. These worms can survive in low oxygen, heavily contaminated water where most other organisms can't. The chart shows this gradient pretty clearly, with different organisms appearing as pollution levels change from low to extreme. Where mayflies thrive, water's healthy. Where only tubifex worms survive, water quality is pretty severely degraded. Beyond indicator species, we use several other biological parameters. Biotic indices like the Trent Biotic Index that's shown here can provide numerical scores based on which organisms are present. The table shows that a biotic index between 0 and 3.75 indicates excellent water quality with organic pollution unlikely. As the index gets higher and higher and rises towards 10, water quality drops to very poor, with severe organic pollution pretty likely. You don't need to memorize the formula for ESS, but you should be able to interpret what biotic index numbers mean. A low number equals good water quality, and a high number signals problems. Other biological indicators include algal growth patterns, the presence of pathogens, fish population sizes and health, and otter populations, which indicate overall wetland health. There's a clear pattern. Biodiversity decreases as pollution increases. Healthy ecosystems support many species, while polluted waters support only a few pollution-tolerant organisms. Here's an important concept for understanding and measuring the impact of water pollution: biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD. BOD is a measure of the amount of dissolved oxygen that is required or demanded by microorganisms to decompose organic material in water. It's how we quantify the oxygen consumption that happens when organic waste breaks down. Let's break down this definition. BOD measures how much dissolved oxygen is needed or demanded by living microorganisms such as bacteria for their metabolic processes. These are the chemical reactions like respiration that happen in their bodies, while those organisms decompose organic matter in water. Think of it this way. When bacteria are working hard to break down waste, they're breathing heavily and they're consuming lots of oxygen. So BOD measures how much oxygen they need to do that work. The more pollution, the more they demand the oxygen. Here's the crucial relationship to understand. BOD is an indirect measure of the amount of organic matter in a water sample. More organic waste means more bacteria working to decompose it, and more bacteria working to decompose it means higher oxygen demand. BOD and dissolved oxygen, or DO, have an inverse relationship. When one goes up, the other goes down. This graph demonstrates this perfectly. Just after pollution enters at point zero, the biochemical oxygen demand spikes dramatically as bacteria multiply to decompose the waste, their new food source. At the same time, the dissolved oxygen, or DO, plummets because the bacteria are using it all. This is exactly like basic economic supply and demand, as the smaller diagram shows. When demand, BOD, is high, the supply of dissolved oxygen, DO, is low. As you move downstream and bacteria finish decomposing the waste, BOD decreases and dissolved oxygen gradually recovers. Now we come to eutrophication, one of the most important concepts in water pollution. This is something that shows up somewhere almost every single year on the ESS examinations. Eutrophication occurs when lakes, estuaries, and coastal waters receive inputs of mineral nutrients, especially nitrates and phosphates. These excess nutrients often cause excessive growth in phytoplankton. These are microscopic, photosynthetic organisms that float in water. So let's walk through exactly how eutrophication creates dead zones. First, the nutrients, the nitrates and the phosphates, enter water from fertilizers, from sewage, and from detergents. These nutrients cause an explosive growth of algae and phytoplankton, and that creates visible blooms that can turn water green or brown. Eventually, all this algae dies and it sinks to the bottom where bacteria begin to decompose it. This decomposition consumes the dissolved oxygen, dramatically increasing the biochemical oxygen demand and lowering the amount of DO in the water. As the bacteria work overtime, breaking down all that organic matter, the dissolved oxygen levels crash. That creates hypoxic conditions, that's low oxygen conditions, or even anoxic conditions where there's no oxygen. In these low oxygen environments, fish and other aquatic consumers die because they literally cannot breathe. The process of eutrophication thus creates dead zones, areas where oxygen levels are so low that most aquatic life can't survive. Eutrophication leads to a sequence of impacts and changes to aquatic systems. It's not just one problem, it's a cascade of interconnected effects that transform entire ecosystems. The Mississippi River provides a pretty dramatic example. This map shows how the Mississippi River and its tributaries drain 41% of the continental United States. All the agricultural runoff, the urban pollution, and the industrial waste from this enormous area eventually flows into the Gulf of Mexico and carrying all the nutrients that cause one of the world's largest dead zones. This map shows dissolved oxygen levels in the Gulf of Mexico. The red areas show extremely low dissolved oxygen and very high BOD. That's the dead zone. Green areas show high dissolved oxygen and low BOD, representing healthy water. Notice how the dead zone spreads along the Louisiana and Texas coasts, exactly where the Mississippi River delivers its nutrient-rich waters. This isn't just an environmental problem, it's an economic one too. These dead zones occur right where a lot of fishing communities depend on healthy marine ecosystems for their livelihoods. Eutrophication can substantially impact ecosystem services. Those are the benefits that humans receive from healthy ecosystems. This illustration shows 4 key services: fishing represented by the fish, recreation shown with people enjoying the water, aesthetics symbolized by starry night beauty, and supporting services like nutrient cycling that are represented by the tree. Let's start with fishing. Eutrophication causes a shift from desirable to undesirable fish species. Species like salmon and trout, which require high oxygen levels and clean water, disappear. They're replaced by species like the Eurasian carp, shown here, which tolerates poor water quality, but isn't as economically valuable or desirable for human consumption. It just doesn't taste as good. Fish kills occur during oxygen depletion events. That means in events when the oxygen levels are dramatically reduced, and it sometimes wipes out entire populations. Reduced fish stocks affect both commercial fishing industries and recreational fishing. Communities that depend on fishing for income and food security face serious challenges when eutrophication destroys their resource base. Recreation suffers significantly from eutrophication as well. Water becomes unsafe for swimming due to harmful algae or bacteria present. Unpleasant smells from decomposing algae makes areas unpleasant to visit. Excessive growth of macrophytes, those are large aquatic plants, blocks waterways, it prevents boats from passing through, it gets tangled in their rotors, and toxic algae blooms can force the closure of entire recreational areas, sometimes for weeks or even months. People lose access to their favorite spots for fishing, for sailing, and for paddleboarding. The economic impact on tourism can be devastating for communities that depend on water-based recreation for income. Aesthetics matter more than you might think. The visual appeal of streams and lakes is dramatically reduced by eutrophication. Scum and algae mats covering water surfaces look and smell terrible, and it makes areas less attractive to both environmentalists and tourists. Water hyacinth and Nile cabbage, which are floating plants that thrive in nutrient-rich water, can completely block open water, and that transforms beautiful lakes into these plant-choked marshes. Studies have shown that this can even reduce property values near affected waters. People don't want to live next to or invest in properties that are near degraded waterways. The health consequences of eutrophication are pretty serious. Research has linked increased rates of stomach cancer to nitrates in drinking water. Blue baby syndrome occurs when infants drink nitrate-contaminated water. Nitrates interfere with the blood's ability to carry oxygen, which can be fatal for young children. Toxic algal blooms pose direct health hazards, producing toxins that can cause liver damage, neurological problems, and skin irritation in people. Contaminated drinking water supplies affect entire communities. The maps shown here compare nitrate levels and gastric cancer rates across regions in Nigeria. Notice any correlation? Areas with higher nitrate levels tend to show higher cancer rates, and that suggests a connection or a correlation between water contamination and public health. Fortunately, eutrophication can be addressed at 3 different levels of management. These levels represent increasing degrees of intervention and effectiveness. The 3-tier approach to pollution management works from most to least effective. Tier 1, to replace the pollutants, focuses on reducing activities that produce pollutants in the first place. Examples include replacing synthetic fertilizers with soil conditioners like compost, biochar, or manure. You could switch to low phosphate and low nitrate detergents, or you could use natural cleaning products like vinegar, baking soda, and lemon juice instead of chemical cleaners. This tier is the hardest to implement because it requires changing human behavior and established habits and practices. However, it's the most effective because it prevents the pollution from ever entering in the environment in the first place. Tier 2, reducing pollutants that enter the ecosystem. This limits the release of pollutants into the environment. It doesn't stop them from being produced, it just limits how much of them get into the environment. That includes treating municipal wastewater to remove nitrates and phosphates before discharge, and maintaining riparian buffer zones along rivers and streams. Those are strips of vegetation that capture and slow agricultural runoff before it reaches the water. The third tier is about restoring ecosystems, and it involves removing pollutants from the environment and restoring damaged ecosystems. This might mean removing contaminated mud from lake bottoms or reintroducing plant and fish species after cleanup efforts. It's the least effective long-term strategy because it doesn't address the source of the pollution, and it has to be repeated continuously as long as the pollutants continue to enter the system. It's like mopping up water without turning off the faucet. That's necessary in the short term, but it's really not a sustainable solution. This 3-tier framework applies not just to eutrophication, but to many other pollution management strategies. The principle remains the same. Prevention is better than cleanup. That's it for our exploration of topic 4.4, water pollution. We've examined major pollution sources from sewage to plastics. We've learned how to measure water quality using chemical and biological parameters. We've understood how eutrophication creates dead zones, and we've explored management strategies at 3 different levels. Remember, you should be able to connect healthy aquatic ecosystems to the social, ecological, and economic pillars of sustainability back in ESS topic 1.3. Protecting aquatic and marine ecosystems requires understanding the complex relationships between pollution sources, ecological impacts, and management solutions. Until next time, happy learning.